they'll start restricting to lose weight, right? And once they start restricting, the brain feels deprived. That often makes them overeat. So they go back and forth, restrict, overeat, restrict, overeat. So there's something in the middle of that, right? There's eating when you're
awake. This is Mental Matters, hosted by Asekho Toto.
Firstly, I just want to say thank you so much for agreeing on doing this with me. And I feel like the conversation that we're going to be touching on, it's quite a conversation that people are afraid to have when it involves eating disorder. And it's something that I would say some of us, also including me, that I haven't understood it in a way of, for me, inviting you to this podcast, in a way, I'm trying to learn more about it. Not only me, but I hope that the audience will be able to get something good out to our conversation and trying to find a correlation between eating disorder and mental health. How does these things interlink in a way? So thank you so much for being here, and I would like to welcome you to Mental Matters.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
You are an eating disorder specialist, clinical social worker, and things that one would definitely say that you are very passionate about the conversation when it comes to eating disorder. And you wrote a book where is What I Am Eating. Am I eating? If I'm not...
Why did I just eat that?
Why did I eat that? And through our conversation, I just want to focus on mental health, eating disorder, and relationship with food. Creating that, I would say, positive relationship, because sometimes there's this thing called stress eating, whereas people don't know how to cope with sometimes stress, and they tend to eat, and that causes a lot of things that within themselves. So in your practice, how have you observed the bidirectional relationship between emotions and eating behaviors? Especially, can you explain how chronic stress and anxiety might affect an individual? How might affect how chronic stress and anxiety might after an individual's hormonal balance and substitute their eating patterns and vice versa. I'm not quite sure if you got the question.
Yeah. Okay. So I think anxiety is at the root for most eating issues, right? People have anxiety and internal anxiety. They don't know what to do with it. Right? It doesn't feel good to have a high level of anxiety. And so people look for coping mechanisms. They look for ways to bring down their anxiety. Some ways are better ways. Some ways aren't so good, right? Some people overshop. Some people use alcohol. Some people, there's a whole bunch of ways that people use coping mechanisms that people use that aren't so good for them. And one of them is food. And so I always say, if hunger isn't the problem, food isn't the solution. So somebody is feeling stressed, for example. I have some clients who turn to food and they eat to lower their stress level. It works in the moment. And then afterwards, they typically feel more stressed. Right? I have other clients that when they feel a lot of stress, they can't eat at all. So it definitely impacts the amount of food that they take in.
It really plays a pivotal role when it comes to food. And sometimes we can't, as individuals, one would say, we can't control ourselves when it comes to food. And something that I also observe within myself, of when I'm a bit stressed and anxious about something, when it comes to food, it feels nice, the food is nice, and actually it hits the dopamine in a way of, nothing is not that bad in a way, but one thing that I observe about creating these coping mechanisms, as you mentioned, alcohol, overspending, overshopping, things like that. It's a temporary thing. It's a temporary solution to a permanent solution if you don't take care of it. And actually, as I mentioned, your book touches on connection between emotions, habits, and physical. Can you elaborate on the long-term psychological effects of diet culture, particularly in relation of self-worth and identity formation? How can individuals work to dismantle these internalized beliefs and build a healthier relationship with food and their bodies?
Yeah, it's really hard because diet culture, has really infiltrated, right? And kind of set up the way people think about food, the way people think about their bodies, right? So there are these images, especially youngsters, that, that they idolize people in smaller bodies, right? And so they'll start restricting to lose weight, right? And once they start restricting, the brain feels deprived. That often makes them overeat. So they go back and forth, restrict, overeat, restrict, overeat. So there's something in the middle of that. Right? There's eating when you're hungry and there's stopping when you're full. And so if you're restricting, you're not eating when you're hungry. You're ignoring your hunger cues, right? If you're overeating, you're not stopping when you're full. You're ignoring your fullness cues. So I encourage people to really try to get in touch with their internal hunger and fullness cues. Like if you think about a baby, right? Baby's born. You put a bottle in their mouth. When they're done, they spit it out. They have those internal fullness cues. But for some people throughout the years, it becomes a coping mechanism or something in their family. Maybe they're taught, clean plate club. You need to finish everything on your plate. It starts to override some of these signals in the brain, and they have to reconnect them and learn again how to eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full.
And as you were explaining in terms of eat when you are hungry, stopping when you are full, it goes back to that thing of having those low self-esteem, of trying to as a coping mechanism on fighting against that, whereas you end up eating food, and when you eat food, you see that validation of, if I keep on eating, no one would actually judge me in a way, no one will be seeing me. And in your practice, have you seen that type of thing of seeing individuals that have that so lowest self-esteem?
Yeah, it's very common. And part of what I work on is empowerment. I call it empowered eating, right? If somebody is using food as a coping mechanism, let's say, right? I can't just take away food as their coping mechanism. I have to give them something else. You can't just take away the way someone's coping and then say, okay, see ya, right? So you have to help them learn other coping mechanisms. So if you're not going to use food, what else can you do? You can journal your feelings. You can keep a food mood diary and make associations between, when I feel sad, I notice I eat. When I feel angry, I notice I eat, right? When I have a fight with my mom, I notice I use food. So I have to teach new coping mechanisms in order to take away the old coping mechanisms that they're using.
And you spoke in terms of towards that thing of the diet culture, and you mentioned mostly young people, and I have put a lot of emphasis on the conversation when it comes to nutrition and also mental health, whereas in terms of me of finding a sense of what is actually eating disorder, how does it impact one, and trying to have guests on this podcast, one thing that I observe is the fact that young people are mostly influenced because of the internet, and also these big influencers of saying that, no, eat this, it's good for your health, and goes with this and this and this and this and this. And it goes back to a conversation that I had with a guest, I think 2 weeks back, whereas we spoke about minerals, how minerals are important for you. And he raised something that is quite interesting, whereas he wrote a book on a calcium lie, and whereas there is a full excess when you consume a huge excess of calcium, whereas it has an effect on your metabolic health. And where your metabolic health, it really affects your mental health, and not realizing that you become more sad, as you've said, that keeping no talking sad, of become more depressed. And in terms of that, as much as you in this field of empowering people to, in terms of not excessive eating, in a way of creating that eating disorder, how do you make sure that your clients maintain that consistency? How do you make sure that they are disciplined enough to not consume a lot of food and create that eating disorder?
Yeah. So I'm both a dietitian and a social worker. I started out my career as a dietitian, so I'm very comfortable helping people figure out the types of foods that their body needs. Everybody's body is a little different, right? If you look at iron needs, for instance, that's gender specific, age specific, right? Our needs change. And so it's important to have somebody guiding you nutritionally who understands the amount of nutrients that your body needs. Also, people like athletes have certain nutritional needs that non-athletes don't have, right? Children have certain nutritional needs that older people don't have. And so helping each kind of person, each client of mine find the right nutrition, kind of their balance is really important. And balance is a huge piece of this because there is no perfect diet. Right. And a lot of people strive for perfection, right? I'm going to eat 100% clean. And then, I teach people that's not realistic, right? Food has many different meanings, right? So it's for nourishment. It's also for satiety, right? We get satiated. It's pleasurable. We socialize around food. And so food has a lot of different meanings. And so, if I call it nourishing foods and fun foods, if we get that balance, 80 or 85% nourishing foods, 15, 20%, there's room for some fun foods in there. And I sometimes have to teach people how to include them.
And for someone that is actually new to the conversation about eating disorder and nutrition, and at first I didn't know that they were correlating. And one of the podcasts that I make sure that I listen and get necessary information is the Huberman podcast, Huberman Lab. Whereas most of the time they talk about nutrition, when we talk about gut health, when they talk about neurological health in terms of how do the things that we do in our everyday lives affect our mental health and also our body. And I want to just move a bit and in terms of social cultural. So beyond physical factors, what do social, cultural, and feminine factors play in the development and perpetuation of eating disorders? How can therapy address the broader influences to create a supportive environment for recovery?
Yeah. So when, there's a difference between disordered eating and an eating disorder, right? So disordered eating, somebody might occasionally overeat, somebody might occasionally skip a meal, right? Somebody might, I don't know, have certain kind of practices that they do. And that's not necessarily an eating disorder. For it to reach the level of an eating disorder, there's certain criteria that must be met, which are listed in the DSM, the diagnostic, the manual, where they have specific behaviors, specific amounts of times that people have to do these behaviors in order for them to be actually diagnosed with an eating disorder. So, I think a lot of people don't realize that, right? They use the term a little loosely. Somebody overeats, they might say, they have binge eating disorder. That's not necessarily true. Maybe they're just overeating every once in a while. But it's really, I'm sorry.
You can go on.
Yeah. So it's important to first of all understand that. And the other part about eating disorders is there's often a genetic link, right? So we usually will see if I have a client come in with an eating disorder, maybe a mom or an aunt or a dad or an uncle or a grandparent, it has to do very much with brain wiring. People don't choose to have an eating disorder. It's not a choice. It's not, I feel stressed, I think I won't eat today. It's their brain is wired to give them that idea, right? Some people become alcoholics once they start drinking. Other people don't. It has to do with a lot about how the brain is wired and genetics.
Actually, it's an interesting way of looking at it. And I 100% agree with you that it's the brain wiring in terms of, in a way, the way you grow up, in the environment you grow up, and when you are told that when you have stress, it's symptoms, your brain register that and ends up creating it as a coping mechanism. That's how I believe it. And it's quite interesting when you look at that way. And in all, as I mentioned earlier, that my knowledge is very little when it comes to the conversation and the differentiation I didn't know. And sometimes when it comes to, I don't have that much knowledge when it comes to the manual. And actually, in terms of, would you say that as a professional, would you say that in terms of binge eating and these things of binge eating, purging, and I forgot the last one actually, because
Anorexia?
come again?
Anorexia?
Yeah, exactly. Because I did a short course on psychotherapy, and in that they included the section for eating disorder. So how does one differentiate it from